home, we're bringing our economy back from the brink of ruin. The last administration and their allies in Congress looted our treasury for trillions of dollars, driving up prices and everything at levels never seen before. I am bringing those high prices down and bringing them down very fast. Let's look at the facts. Under the Biden administration, car prices rose 22% and in many states 30% or more. Gasoline rose 30 to 50%. Hotel rates rose 37%. Airfares rose 31%. Now, under our leadership, they are all coming down and coming down fast. Democrat politicians also sent the cost of groceries soaring, but we are solving that too. The price of a Thanksgiving turkey was down 33% compared to the Biden last year. The price of eggs.
So here we sit confronting this demagogic spectacle, and you have just witnessed Donald Trump not merely lying to you but constructing an alternative reality with the shamelessness of an absolute authoritarian rewriting history as he stands in the ruins of an economy that he is actively immolating, while proclaiming victory, while claiming rescue, while insisting that down is up, and that your grocery bills have shrunk when any person on earth can walk into a supermarket and see with their own eyes that this is categorically false. And this matters because what you are witnessing here is not just political spin of the familiar sort, but something far more sinister and philosophically dangerous, a wholesale assault on the very concept of empirical truth itself, in service of consolidating power. And this is how fascism moves, friends. Not with jackboots at first, but with the slow erasure of shared reality, until we inhabit separate universes where some people believe that eggs are affordable and inflation has been tamed, and others live in the actual material world where grocery prices have continued rising since Trump took office in January 2025, increasing 1.4% through September, and where beef prices hit record highs, up 14.7% in the past year, and where working families watch their purchasing power erode in real time, despite being told they should be grateful for the miracle recovery underway. And let's immediately dismantle the central lie at the heart of Trump's performance here, because when he tells you that egg prices are down 82% since March, what you need to understand is that Trump's percentage figures are wildly inaccurate, and that the actual story of egg prices reveals both the mendacity of his accounting and the fundamental structural forces he refuses to address, because the primary cause of egg price spikes has been highly pathogenic avian influenza spreading since 2022, with tens of millions of hens killed to prevent virus spread. And most of the egg price decline this year was due to bird flu season ending with wild bird migration patterns happening before Trump's policies went into effect. So Trump is literally taking credit for seasonal disease patterns, while the deeper structural crisis of industrial animal agriculture and climate-driven pandemic acceleration goes completely unaddressed. The man is performing prestidigitation with disease vectors and calling it economic policy and demanding applause for the rotation of the Earth around the sun. And yet here we are analyzing whether his miracle is real, when the very premise deserves to be laughed out of serious discourse, except that millions of Americans are being sold this fantasy, while their material conditions deteriorate. But wait, because here comes the truly enraging element of this charade, which is that Trump blames the Biden administration for supposedly looting the treasury and driving inflation to unprecedented heights when in fact, inflation during Biden's term was rooted in COVID-19 pandemic economic fallout, creating supply, demand, and labor issues globally, with stimulus spending under Biden contributing, but not as the sole cause, and overall inflation was 21.2% during Biden's 4 years, which yes caused real pain for working families, but occurred in the context of real GDP growth in both 2023 and 2024 that exceeded major forecasts under the Biden administration, with an economy demonstrating remarkable resilience, and yet Trump inherits this genuinely strong foundation, and then proceeds to light it on fire with his tariff madness and mass deportation threats, while proclaiming that he rescued us from the brink. And this inversion of reality would be almost comedic if it weren't so dangerous, because what he's doing is gaslighting on a societal scale. And the grocery price question is where his dishonesty becomes most visceral, because every single American interacts with food costs and can verify these claims against lived experience, which is why Trump's insistence that grocery prices are way down represents such breathtaking contempt for the public, because grocery prices were up again in September 2025 and have increased since the start of Trump's presidency, and average grocery prices rose 1.4% between January and September 2025 and rose 2.7% year over year, with a 0.6% spike from July to August. That was the biggest monthly increase in 3 years, followed by another 0.3% increase from August to September. And these are not abstractions. These are the food bills that families are paying at checkout counters across this country, while Trump stands before cameras declaring victory and dismissing their financial struggles as a hoax perpetrated by Democrats. And Trump told crowds in Pennsylvania that affordability was a hoax, claims that are not backed by official government economic data, which is such a staggering example of authoritarian reality denial that it should alarm anyone who values democratic discourse, because when a president tells you that your actual experience of economic hardship is fictional, when he insists that your grocery bills are a conspiracy theory, he is demanding that you surrender your own perception of reality to his narrative, and that is the architecture of totalitarian thought control. Now let's talk about what's actually driving the continued price pressures, because this is where we need to pivot from debunking Trump's lies, understanding the systemic forces at work, and exposing the neoliberal consensus that both parties have enabled for decades, because the uncomfortable truth that Democrats sometimes shy away from is that corporate profits drove 53% of inflation during the second and third quarters of 2023, and more than one-third since the start of the pandemic, according to analysis by the Groundwork Collaborative examining Commerce Department data. Even as of the second quarter of 2024, corporate profits could explain roughly a third of price growth since the end of 2019, much higher than the long-run average of just 11.5%, as documented by the Economic Policy Institute. And corporate profits drove 53% of inflation in the second and third quarters of 2023, compared to just 11% of price growth over the 40 years prior to the pandemic, which means we are witnessing unprecedented corporate profiteering disguised as inevitable economic forces. And while Trump pretends to be the populist champion of working people, he has done absolutely nothing to constrain corporate power, and in fact, food economists note that two of Trump's signature policies, tariffs on imported goods including food and crackdowns on undocumented immigrants who make up a large percentage of farm workers, have clearly contributed to grocery price increases, so his economic nationalism theater is actively making affordability worse while he claims to be solving it. And we need to sit with the grotesque irony here, which is that Trump campaigned relentlessly on inflation and grocery prices, mobilizing working-class rage at economic precarity, positioning himself as the answer to material suffering, and then upon taking office he has presided over the loss of 361,000 jobs formerly held by working-class people without college degrees, and 58,000 manufacturing jobs since his Liberation Day tariffs were announced, along with slowing wage growth and rising prices for food and essentials, according to analysis by the Center for American Progress examining 2025 employment data. While Trump inherited an economy with high working-class real wage growth of 2.1% annually in January, wage growth has slowed since then, falling by 0.5 percentage points for workers with high school education or less, and by 0.7 percentage points for workers with associate degrees through September, because wages aren't rising fast enough while inflation remains elevated, and 57% of Americans disapprove of how Trump is handling the economy, with only 36% approving, the lowest the PBS News/Marist poll has found across both of his terms, and 7 in 10 Americans say the cost of living is unaffordable, including nearly half of Republicans and 3/4 of independents, which represents a political crisis for Trump, but more importantly a material crisis for tens of millions of families watching their economic security crumble. But here is where the analysis must sharpen into a blade, because it's not enough to simply fact-check Trump's deceptions. We must understand the ideological function they serve, which is to maintain the fiction that our economic system is fundamentally sound, and that prosperity is just around the corner, if only we eliminate the saboteurs, the immigrants, the regulatory bureaucrats, the Democratic politicians who allegedly looted the treasury, and this scapegoating mechanism is essential to right-wing politics because it forecloses any interrogation of capitalism itself, any examination of how corporate concentration and oligarchic power and financialization and labor market deregulation have systematically transferred wealth upward for 40 years, creating the precarity that Trump now exploits, and his entire rhetorical strategy depends on channeling justified working-class anger away from the actual ruling class and toward vulnerable populations and partisan enemies, while preserving the extractive systems that generate inequality, and the fact that Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell said that Trump's tariffs are solely responsible for prices growing faster than the Fed's 2% target this year, should tell you everything about how Trump's nationalist economic theater is a disaster for the very people he claims to champion, because tariffs are making affordability worse, not better. And yet he continues to tout them as accomplishments while regular people absorb the costs. And we need to talk about the specific numerical deceptions Trump deploys here, because they reveal the contempt underlying his populist cosplay, the casual assumption that his supporters won't fact-check him, or that truth simply doesn't matter in the construction of political narrative. So when he claims that car prices rose 22% under Biden, and gasoline rose 30 to 50%, and hotel rates rose 37%, and airfares rose 31%, he's cherry-picking peak inflation moments and comparing them to current prices in ways that erase context, because while gas prices did hit an all-time high of 5.116 per gallon in June 2022 under Biden, and the current average is 2.9988, which is almost a 50% decrease from that peak, comparing current prices to a year ago shows gas down just 0.5%. Airline fares were actually up 3.2% in September under Trump compared to a year earlier, while hotel room rates are down 0.8%, and car rental prices down 5% over the past year. Which means the all coming down and coming down fast rhetoric is selective nonsense, designed to create an impression of economic miracle that simply does not exist in aggregate. And the turkey price claim is similarly dishonest because the price of Thanksgiving turkey was down, but only by 3.7% for national brands, with the overall cost of a Thanksgiving meal falling by 2% this year, according to the Wells Fargo Agri-Foods Institute, nowhere near the 33% Trump claims. Now let's examine what Trump is actually doing to the economy beyond his propaganda, because this is where progressive analysis must be unflinching and comprehensive, because Trump's proposed $2,000 tariff rebate checks would inject fresh demand into an economy constrained by supply shortages, with the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimating these rebates would cost roughly $600 billion per year in deficit-financed stimulus, according to analysis by the Progressive Policy Institute, and the central flaw of Biden's approach 4 years ago was overwhelming focus on subsidizing demand while doing too little to expand supply, contributing to 40-year high inflation, and Trump is now repeating those same policy mistakes with more damaging consequences, making his affordability agenda, all about boosting purchasing power without addressing supply-side challenges, actually responsible for higher prices. And this represents such a catastrophic misdiagnosis of our economic problems that it verges on economic malpractice, because what American families need is not more cash chasing the same constrained supply of goods, but rather massive public investment in productive capacity, in housing construction, in renewable energy infrastructure, in supply chain resilience, in worker power to claim their share of productivity gains, and instead Trump offers tariff gimmicks and corporate tax cuts and deregulation that will further concentrate wealth while destabilizing the foundations of a functional economy. And here is where we must connect the economic failures to the authoritarian impulses, because they are not separate phenomena, but rather mutually reinforcing dynamics. And when Trump told a Pennsylvania rally that concerns about affording groceries, electricity, and healthcare were a hoax concocted by Democrats and falsely claimed prices are coming down very substantially, as NPR reported, he is engaging in the classic authoritarian move of denying material reality and demanding loyalty to the leader's narrative over your own experience. And University of Michigan economist Betsy Stevenson told NPR that Trump is playing with fire by making false claims about prices when consumers can see costs persistently rising, noting Trump's claims about inflation are false, and you can go to the grocery store and see it yourself. And this represents such naked gaslighting that even some Republicans are breaking ranks, because Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene told PBS NewsHour that affordability, or the lack of ability of Americans to afford the cost of living, is not a Democrat hoax, pointing to record credit card debt as evidence. And when you've lost Marjorie Taylor Greene on the question of whether economic hardship is real, you have departed so far from empirical reality that your entire political project has become unmoored from the material world. We are living through what might be called a crisis of affordability denialism, where the President of the United States simply refuses to acknowledge that fully 45% of Americans say prices are their top economic concern, far ahead of housing prices at 18%, according to the NPR/PBS News Marist poll, and 2/3 of Americans are very or somewhat concerned about the impact of tariffs on their personal finances, and yet Trump continues to tout tariffs as major accomplishments, even though Federal Reserve Chair Powell reported that inflation growth is happening entirely in goods sectors where tariffs exist, which should be a screaming alarm that policy is actively harming the people it purports to help. But Trump is so invested in the tariff narrative as economic nationalism that he cannot acknowledge the damage it causes, and this ideological rigidity in service of nationalist mythology at the expense of working-class material interests is textbook reactionary politics dressed up in populist rhetoric. And let's talk about the systemic context that Trump's analysis completely erases, because inflation didn't emerge from nowhere, and Biden didn't create it by looting the treasury. These are right-wing fantasies designed to obscure the actual dynamics of our political economy, which include decades of corporate consolidation that has put strain on consumers' wallets along with supply chain bottlenecks and the war in Ukraine and excessive profit-taking in America. As NBC News reported, and the pandemic disruption that revealed the fragility of just-in-time supply chains and the dependence on global production networks vulnerable to breakdown, and the inadequacy of social safety nets that left workers desperate and vulnerable. But instead of addressing these structural failures, Trump offers us scapegoats and spectacle, and the promise that if we just punish the right enemies and erect the right barriers, everything will return to some imagined golden age of prosperity, which is a fascist narrative structure applied to economic policy. And we've seen this movie before, and it doesn't end well. What Trump will never tell you is that his first-term tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations, his deregulation of industries, his assault on labor power, his elevation of Wall Street over Main Street, all of these policies contributed to the underlying conditions of precarity and inequality that made the pandemic's economic impact so devastating for working people and so profitable for the already rich, because after-tax corporate profits continued to climb year after year, under Biden setting new records, increasing to about $2.9 trillion in 2021, $3 trillion in 2023, and roughly $3.5 trillion in 2024, up about 58.2% from 2020's $2.2 trillion, according to Bureau of Economic Analysis, data, and yes, this happened under Biden, which is why progressives correctly critique the limitations of centrist democratic economic policy, but Trump wants to take that system of oligarchic extraction and supercharge it with more tax cuts, more deregulation, more corporate power while performing economic populism and expecting working people to believe his lies about grocery prices as their budgets collapse under the weight of his actual policies. The cruel genius of Trump's economic rhetoric is that it speaks to real suffering while systematically obscuring its causes and perpetuating its sources, and this is why we cannot simply debunk his lies. Though we must do that, we must also articulate the alternative progressive vision of economic justice that centers worker power and public investment, and decommodification of essential goods and democratic control over our economic destiny. Because when people are suffering and angry, they will turn to whoever offers them an explanation, and a villain, and if the left cannot provide that alternative analysis, connecting material hardship to systemic exploitation under capitalism, then the right will continue to provide false consciousness, linking hardship to immigrants and bureaucrats, and partisan enemies, and the authoritarian right will use economic crisis as the justification for eliminating democracy, and Trump's performance here is a preview of that strategy, the insistence that things are actually great, and anyone who says otherwise is a liar and a traitor, the demand that we disbelieve our own experiences in favor of the leader's narrative, the scapegoating of political opponents for economic problems, while the actual ruling class enriches itself behind the curtain of nationalist theater, and every person listening to this needs to understand that what you are witnessing is not normal political dishonesty, but rather the construction of authoritarian epistemology, where truth becomes whatever serves power, and your material conditions become irrelevant to the official narrative of national greatness. And this is how democracies die, not with a bang, but with the slow suffocation of shared reality, until we inhabit informational universes, so separate that collective action becomes impossible, and oligarchic rule becomes inevitable, because we can no longer agree on basic facts. And so when you hear Trump say that he is bringing prices down, and bringing them down very fast, you need to understand that this is not merely a lie about economic data, but rather a test of your willingness to surrender your own perception to his authority. And every time we allow these lies to pass, without calling them what they are, we participate in the erosion of truth as a meaningful political category, and the installation of power as the only arbiter of reality. And this is the fight we're in now. Not just over policies or electoral outcomes, but over whether we will inhabit a shared, empirical world where material conditions matter, and evidence means something, or whether we will descend into a post-truth authoritarian landscape where the leader's word becomes law, regardless of what you see at the grocery store, or in your bank account, or in your community, and the stakes could not be higher, because once you've surrendered the ability to name your own reality, you've lost the capacity for democratic resistance. And Trump knows this, which is why he lies so brazenly, so constantly, so without shame, because every lie that goes unchallenged, or is merely treated as normal, political spin rather than an assault on reality itself, is a victory for authoritarianism, and a defeat for the possibility of collective liberation based on shared understanding of our common conditions under systems of exploitation that we might together transform, if only we could agree that they exist. And that brings me to the final urgent point, which is that progressive movements must do more than fact-check. We must offer the counter-narrative that names capitalism as the source of the precarity that Trump exploits. We must build worker power as the material basis for economic justice. We must demand democratic control over investment and production. We must articulate a vision of abundance through public goods and solidarity, rather than scarcity through market competition. And we must never ever allow demagogues to gaslight working people about their own material suffering, because that suffering is real, and it demands transformation, not performance, not lies, not scapegoating, but the hard work of building a more just economy and a more democratic society, and that work begins with insisting on truth even when power demands we embrace fantasy.